Can you imagine Bryan Kohberger walking up to your door, responding as a police officer to a domestic situation? Thank God he didn't get the opportunity to be anywhere near the Pullman Police Department. There's a hero police chief we're going to talk about, though, and how he flinched upon hearing Bryan Kohberger's name, how this man saved some pretty critical, crucial video footage of Bryan and his travels, and the reason why this man followed his gut and did not let confessed killer Bryan Kohberger get a job with the Pullman Police Department out in Washington only months before those horrific murders of the 4 University of Idaho students. They all lost their lives. Kaylee Gonzalez, Ethan Chapin, Xana Kernodle, and Madison Maddie Mogan. We're going to talk more about what may have inspired Bryan Kohberger, but we're getting more information from this upcoming book. The author, Vicky Ward, she's releasing excerpts. And now we finally know, after all these years, why Bryan was turned down for this job he wanted. Okay, so it wasn't the job of a police patrol officer out on the street in uniform that Bryan was going for. But perhaps it was the first step to getting closer to some victims. Who knows what was on Kohberger's mind? But Bryan interviewed for this job on Tuesday, April 12th, 2022. It was almost 7 months exactly to the day that the slaughter happened. But thank the Lord for this police chief. I'm calling him a hero. His name is Gary Jenkins. He turned Bryan down, and he would be very, very happy many months later, many months later, when he found out who Bryan was and his role in the killings. He would be very happy he turned Bryan down. We will also talk about how hero Gary once again followed his gut, and he did something to save video footage that would have been automatically deleted after 60 days, even though Gary himself was being kept in the dark. It seems like a lot of people started following their guts, or they were frustrated in the wake of these November 13th, 2022 killings in Moscow, Idaho, because Moscow police were tight-lipped. Even now, they admit they were too tight-lipped. That's what Police Chief James Fry told author Vicky Ward. He admitted his silence those first few days could have been better. He could have spoken out more. Of course, we know Moscow, Idaho wasn't used to murders, let alone a quadruple homicide, close up and violent with a K-bar knife. There wasn't exactly media training on that. How do you stand in front of a gaggle of press, a whole room full of worried people, and express to the public, don't worry, we don't know who did this, but don't leave the university in droves, guys. I really think part of that was on people's mind, the way they handled this entire crisis from the get-go. I remember hearing about the killings, but I also remember, as I started researching it, being frustrated with the confusing messaging as it started to trickle out. Remember how I always hated that tweet, that vandal alert? It was posted November 13th, 2022, the same day as the murders. We know the murders happened early that morning. We know 911 wasn't called until about 11:58. Close to noon, local time in Moscow. So the tweet came out at 5:07 p.m. It said, Moscow PD is investigating a homicide. A singular, basically, a homicide. Not 4 homicides, which they already knew. They said, Moscow PD is investigating a homicide. Now, I understand how the 911 call was confusing. It was confusing because, as we'll learn even more, Hunter went up there. He was protecting the girls. I don't know what he saw. I don't think he wanted to frighten Bethany and Dylan, the surviving roommates. So I think he said something about maybe Xana's passed out. He wasn't like, oh my Lord, look at all the blood, they're dead. He didn't go there. I'm sure he didn't want to freak the girls out. So that's where the passed out language came from. And I applaud him for at least trying to protect these frightened roommates, these girls. And so I understand why the first alert and the first police blotter, everything said, okay, one unresponsive person. But pretty soon in that 911 call, towards the end, we heard, wait a minute, homicide. Okay, looks like a homicide. When when the cop made it there. And maybe the officer had only seen Xana at that point. Maybe he only saw one person. So I understand that. But by 5:07 p.m., the vandal alert that's going out is saying Moscow PD is investigating a homicide. I read that as singular, not several homicides or 4 homicides, on King Road near campus. Suspect is not known at this time. So that was true. Stay away from the area and shelter in place. Now that's a good alert, save for the fact that it said 1 homicide. Obviously they knew by then that 4 people had been killed. Even if I'm looking at East Coast time, if I'm looking at things in my time zone, it still would have been 2:07 p.m. in Moscow when that vandal alert went out. If they knew about 4 people being brutally slain by then, why didn't they just tell the truth and say 4 homicides? I mean, that would have really gotten people's attention, like, wait, what? 4 homicides? People already started to know something was going wrong. The police tape around, they started informing the families of the victims, something's going on. I don't think they wanted to tell students the truth. Of course, they didn't want to freak students out. But also, I can't ignore, as I research all this, there's got to be some aspect of them not wanting to lose university money, to lose any tourism, anything they had coming in. I'm not saying that was at the top of their minds that day, but it is curious the way that alert went out. And then at 6:01 p.m., the very next day, Monday, November 14th, a man named Andrew Bartlein, I guess you say it, he wrote, "Just got on scene. Long drive, y'all, where tape still blocks off the property. 1 Moscow police car is on the property." Some people took that to mean, wait, are they really taking this seriously? Do they not want a lot of attention? What's happening? Whatever was truly happening, we didn't get a lot of solid answers those first day or two. We didn't hear from the Moscow police chief that first day or two. It was causing confusion. And that silence and secrecy has kind of continued over 3 years almost. No wonder media lawyers are fighting today, Wednesday, July 9th, 2025, to get this gag order finally dropped. Get it dropped. All these FOIAs I'm putting in, some of them are coming through in terms of just responses, no evidence yet. I'm getting responses and a lot of them are saying the non-dissemination order is still in effect. It took Kaylee's parents hours to find out their daughter and Maddie, her best friend Maddie Mogan, were dead. Along with, eventually they found out Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin were dead. Let's look at how the lawyers are fighting this gag order. I keep refreshing this page, the state of Idaho versus Bryan C. Kohberger, so much because I know it's coming, because we can see the motions being put in. We can see it from the case documents. The day after Bryan pled guilty, so this would be July 3rd, 2025, we see all these motions, and the motions are all to be heard as interested parties, motions to vacate non-dissemination order, a memo in support of the order. Wendy Olson, this lawyer, in support of the motion to be heard as an interested party to basically get rid of this gag order. Like it's time enough already. Rebecca Boone, in support of the order. Now it looks like Rebecca Boone, if it's the same woman, she's a journalist. And we know Wendy Olson is a media lawyer. Now before we start reading excerpts from Vicky's book and we talk all about how Bryan was not allowed to work with the Pullman Police Department, let's talk a little bit about what it's going to take to get this gag order dropped so we can finally start getting more evidence. Previously, we were able to confirm, yes, indeed, Bryan did interview for this job, for this fellowship, this job at the Pullman Police Department. We got the email. Thankfully, stuff like that was released. However, all the extra questions about, like, where did the interview take place? Was Bryan, did he literally fly out to Pullman back earlier in 2022? And if so, was anyone else missing or harmed at that point? Well, no, it turns out Bryan did this interview over Zoom, we're learning. So that's a confirmation from Vicky Ward. And all the other stuff we want to know, like, was Bryan Kohberger really posing as Papa Rogers on Facebook? And the stuff that investigators likely have the answer to. If they've subpoenaed Meta and if they know Bryan's logins and they know his movements and everything after the murders and before, those answers can come as soon as we get discovery. However, Bryan's defense attorneys have been fighting the release of a lot of stuff. And even the prosecutors were okay with this gag order. So back in June in 2023, Bryan Kohberger's defense attorney was calling the media, oh, it's grotesque the way they've covered this murder case, as they were asking the judge to keep this gag order in place, which was really maybe overreaching and broad. All right, I see what they mean. In this instance, this globe cover is kind of gross. It's from December 26th, I believe, 2022, the day after Christmas. It's saying helter skelter message, scrawled in blood. Like, what are they talking about? Are they referring to Charles Manson or the newer murders? It says new Manson cult, butchered Idaho co-eds. What new Manson cult? What are they talking about? So they're comparing it. Killer's sick motive, revealed at last. They don't even know who the killer was at that point. Twisted ties to Tate LaBianca murders from way back in 1969, the year I was born. But I see what they mean. This is weird, but still, why should all media have to pay for something like this with a gag order? It doesn't make sense. And by the way, I found the new documents I was looking for. They have uploaded them to the Idaho website, and it turns out the prosecution doesn't want the gag order lifted until sentencing. So I guess we can wait till July 23rd. I don't know how it would impact Bryan's sentencing at this point if the gag order was lifted. I mean, how could it impact it? He's still going to get all those LWOPs, life without parole. So I don't know. It's just weird. Latah County Judge John Judge, we remember him. He heard all these arguments back in June 2023. A lawyer for Kaylee's family was there, attorneys representing the media, and everyone was there. Because soon after Bryan Kohberger was arrested in December 2022, bless God they found him so soon, because if they hadn't, we'll talk about how this video footage might have been deleted, if not for Chief Gary. So Bryan was arrested late December. Pretty soon after, there was this gag order. No one talked to the media. Investigators, you can't release any public records. So people have just had all these questions and not many confirmations since then. So the prosecutors wanted the gag order to stay in place at that point too. They wanted to ensure a fair trial. Of course, they wanted him to have his fair day in court, but prosecutors weren't slamming the media back then like Bryan's defense attorneys were. So defense attorney J. Weston Logsdon said, the media of 2023 is not a good place to go. We're trying to resolve issues, not make them worse. He went on to say, the push by the media is to show in every possible way that the state has it right. This is their guy. And the question is, how long until we get him to the firing squad? It's grotesque. Is that what's grotesque? That Bryan could face consequences for his crimes? Or is this attorney eating crow now and thinking, you know what? What's really grotesque? 4 young people slaughtered in the prime of life by some guy who hated them for absolutely no reason. I think that's grotesque. But he didn't offer any specific examples. This attorney he's calling the media grotesque back then, he wasn't offering any specific examples of how the media is grotesque. He could have used this one. I might as well be a lawyer. Now, I understand back in Ted Bundy's day, another one of Bryan's heroes, Bryan was literally, after the murders, he was literally searching for this Ted Bundy documentary on YouTube and watching it. In close time of the murders, Bryan Kohberger was literally watching a Ted Bundy documentary. I forgot to put that in my last video comparing him to maybe one of his heroes, and he was even dressing like Ted Bundy. Now, I do agree I did hear some gross media coverage way back then. Standards have changed, but with Bundy's crimes, it turns out one particular publication, I don't know which one, would call the missing girls, Miss April, Miss May, Miss June, when they're talking about who's missing each month. Because Ted Bundy was doing away with so many women, it was like every single month a girl went missing. Now that's crass. I get that. But Bryan's attorney Logsdon, he didn't have examples. Attorneys for the media were saying, look, it makes it easier to have access to information for journalists in order to educate and inform the community, not only about the case, but about the judicial system overall. So true. All these questions people have and all these arguments, it could easily be settled by police just telling the truth. Like, Bryan being stopped with his father twice in Indiana. Writer Howard Blum said, okay, that was intentional. The FBI was following him. They were stopping him maybe just to see, keep an eye on Bryan, see what he would say. Meanwhile, police are saying, nope, just a coincidence. We just stopped him. We just so happened to stop Bryan twice, on the way to get Thai food. So what's the truth? Well, anyway, Wendy Olson, I'm glad to see these documents coming through. She's representing the coalition of journalists, and she's saying, I love that she said this, in her experience, there are other ways to mitigate potential overexposure to a potential jury pool. You can always change the venue. That's what they did. All this stuff. They changed the venue all the way to Boise, and Bryan still ended up pleading guilty. All this question about, overexposure, all this media and these social media people, saying all this stuff about Bryan Kohberger. Wendy Olson, the attorney, is saying, look, jury questioning and the passage of time. Unfortunately, this gag order to me has made it worse over the passage of time because certain facts that could be settled years ago, when it leaves a vacuum, when it leaves a gap of time, it allows people time to just fill in the blanks with whatever fiction they want. Perhaps if we had known a lot more evidence in the beginning, it wouldn't have given all this time for people to become Bryan Kohberger fans. Perhaps if more people had more solid facts from the beginning, as soon as police knew them, it wouldn't have been so much of, Bryan's so innocent. All they have on him is just the DNA on the sheath snap, and that's about it. It turns out later we finally learned, and I know these things take time, all his movements on Amazon, other weird movements. Remember towards the beginning when the mayor of Moscow called the Kohberger killings a crime of passion initially? That was confusing. But Chief Fry never committed to that misspeak. I don't know if the mayor called it a crime of passion because of just how violent it was, or because that's like a back in the day term. I don't know why he called it that. But Fry was like, look, we're looking into every aspect way back then. He wasn't going to say it was a crime of passion. And then Bryan himself went on to repeat that phrase. Bryan told a neighbor, this neighbor who was interviewed by CBS News, who didn't want to be identified. The neighbor said Bryan brought it up in conversation about the killings. This is, of course, after the murders, but before Bryan was caught. Bryan was still in Pullman, Washington at this point. The neighbor said Bryan brought it up in conversation. He asked this neighbor if the neighbor had heard about the murders, which they did. The neighbor said, Bryan said, yeah, seems like they have no leads. Seems like it was a crime of passion. So Bryan was kind of just laughing in the cops' faces. It was only a few days after the murders had happened. There wasn't much information. And Bryan, he might have kind of been gloating, like instead of course, leaving town, changing his routine. After the murders, didn't Bryan even go for a checkup? People want to know about that checkup. I don't know how much we'd find out about that because of HIPAA laws. People want to know, did he have any scars on him or what? It's weird how people say Bryan acted even, I guess, nicer, more polite after the murders. It's like a kettle boiling over, lets off steam by killing all these people. He comes back to class just passing out better grades he didn't used to pass out prior to the murders. But it's kind of weird to me. This gives us more of an inkling of the type of guy he wanted to become. He brought up the murders with his neighbor. Isn't that bold of a murderer? You'd think he'd be slinking away. But Ted Bundy was bold too. He gave his kidnapped victims his real first name. So almost like Ted, Bryan is sitting up here, did you hear about those murders? Picking this guy's brain, his neighbor's brain, I guess, guy or girl, to say, hey, did you hear about that happened? Yeah, I don't think they have any leads. Basically, I think it's a crime of passion. Bryan was probably just laughing inside, thinking, I got away with it. I will become this notorious killer. Did he plan to move on to different college campuses? Did he have any other plans to continue? And another thing that was scary about cops in Moscow being so tight-lipped, but I'm not criticizing them. I'm grateful they got their man. They did the work. They got their man. They got a conviction because he has entered a guilty plea. So they did, no matter what people may think they did wrong, at least, praise the Lord, in the end, they got this monster locked up. In this documentary on Peacock, I still want to go over it with you guys, but I had to talk about this first. There's so much going on in this case. So much coming out for this case. But there was a WSU student in the Peacock documentary, the girl who kept her back to the camera because she was afraid of Bryan. In the Peacock documentary, The Idaho Student Murders, one line really stopped me that she said. I had to scrub through and find it again today. She said, quote, "When the murders first came out, Washington State University said, it wasn't really our business. So we continued classes right after the murders like nothing happened." Once you see how close these campuses are, I mean, that statement blows my mind. But in a way it doesn't. Again, just like Moscow, I guess, didn't want all the University of Idaho students just fleeing and going home, I'm sure Washington State University wanted the same. They wanted their students there. They wanted incoming students to not be afraid. I do not blame the students who decided to go home. I probably would have done the same thing. In this Peacock documentary, which I hope to talk with you about in the next video, girls, friends of the victims, they talked about just being so afraid they would not sleep alone. So I was thinking I'd do the same thing. There was this one case in college where this girl, a friend of mine, had gone through something, and that's what we did in the dorm. We pushed all our beds together and we just let her stay in our room because she didn't want to be alone. So I don't blame these girls, going through the trauma of losing their friends. Some maniac is still on the loose. Police are being tight-lipped, even though they did start speaking eventually. So I don't blame people who decided to go home or just pair up and never be alone. Well, let's talk about Gary Jenkins and how he found out about Bryan Kohberger's arrest later than he should have, in my opinion. And let's talk about this job that Bryan was trying to get from Police Chief Gary Jenkins. He was Pullman Police Chief at this time, back in April 2022. According to the WSU University website, there's this job that I believe Bryan was trying to get. It's a doctoral level graduate research assistantship for public safety. Isn't that ironic? For public safety. It's a unique program. It's a collab between the Department of Justice and Criminology, the graduate school, and the cities of Pullman and Pasco. So I don't know how much this job paid, but I was thinking, was Bryan really wanting it not only for the money, but also for access to Pullman PD? How much access would it have granted him? Would he have been able to go on ride-alongs with actual police officers? We saw a ride-along guy. Remember all that body cam footage that appeared from the 1122 King Road house, and all the complaints about the parties, they started coming out after the murders because people were public requesting them. We wanted to see what happened in this house. There were parties. I think it was the one where he was pouring out all the White Claw. There was a guy, probably a regular citizen, on a ride-along. And memory serving now, that guy had even made some quips about one of the girls and how good she looked or something. I'd really have to go back. So that was kind of creepy. But anyway, imagine if that were Bryan, if he was given this kind of access. Thankfully, he wasn't. However, he probably wanted to use it for nefarious purposes, obviously, whatever they were, like other serial killers have done. To learn about this job, I had to read. One student who got the job boasted that the research for public safety fellowship and the knowledge that she gained through her involvement with the Pullman Police Department, she called it extremely unique, and it'll benefit her when she transitions to her career. I don't know what her career would have been, but would Bryan have used it to, get on the law enforcement track, or get on what track was he going? This woman said it allowed her, this job that Bryan wanted, to contribute to efforts producing positive changes in the field and within the Pullman PD. She says she was fortunate to help the Pullman PD in other projects, including an evaluation of the suitability of red light camera systems, a research brief on best practices in responding to domestic violence. What if that had been Bryan's role? And developing police contact surveys, collabing with police advisory committees. I shudder to think of the rooms it would have given Bryan. He didn't get that job, but he did get the job of a teacher's assistant. I don't know how much he got paid there, but I believe I read something about the benefits. Perhaps it would have taken care of the costs of him living there. Remember, his parents are just working class people. I believe his father was a custodian with the school system, and his mother did something, maybe in the educational field as well. They weren't rolling in the dough. And remember his mom we found? She wrote that proud Reddit post on that like redecorating sub or whatever, when she was just talking about her son moving out to Washington and all this stuff. They probably really thought, despite all of Bryan's troubles, everything he went through as a youth, stealing this, stealing that, experiencing visual snow, having a drug problem, stealing his sister's iPhone, Lord knows what else we don't know about yet. Maybe she finally thought, oh, he's doing so much better. You know, he graduated from DeSales and now he's moving out. He's moving on up. He's going to get his PhD from Pullman. You know, he's got this teacher's assistant job. Well, it all went to hell, as we know. So let's read about this. Vicky Ward, and I've linked to her Substack, her book coming out, everything. I suggest you go refer to that. Excellent. She wrote a Substack post and gave us a little snippet from her book. It's called Inside the Hours Before Bryan Kohberger's Arrest, a sneak preview from the Idaho 4. Vicky Ward's investigates. Now again, remember, I pre-ordered the Kindle version. It's going for $16.99. It should be released Monday, July 14th. So in her Substack email, Vicky wrote, there's a big moment in the Idaho 4 around a police chief who isn't James Fry, that's the Moscow guy, Moscow's police chief, at the time of the college murders, that will likely take readers by surprise. It did surprise me because I was like thinking about these details, oh my goodness. She gives a little spoiler alert. If you don't want to know what it is, don't watch the video or read ahead. It's so funny how people go nuts over spoilers. Spoilers do not bother me at all, but I guess I'm giving a spoiler alert here too. I like that Key and Peele segment where it's like, 5-10 years later, some people are like, no, don't tell me, I haven't watched it yet. Spoilers should be allowed to, come out after years. Anyway, Vicky wrote, it comes when the FBI is readying a dawn raid on Bryan Kohberger's parents' home in Pennsylvania in order to arrest him for the murders of Kaylee Gonzalez, Maddie Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. So that part had me reeling. I'm like, they waited until the end of December to tell WSU Chief Jenkins that they were honing in on Bryan. Now, I know they didn't find out necessarily about Bryan too early, but they didn't collab at all. Moscow PD did not collab at all with Pullman PD, which is unusual. Let me tell you, I'm learning it's unusual. Pullman and Moscow are so close. The campuses are like 10 miles away or something. They are so close, they usually collab on stuff because a crime happens here. Someone usually crosses the border. They're fleeing into a different state. So they work well together. But no, Moscow was being so tight-lipped. I understand being tight-lipped with the public. I mean, they were tight-lipped with the family too, but which I realize they have to do that sometimes too. But they were tight-lipped even with the police chief at Pullman. Anyway, Vicky wrote, it is at this moment that Moscow Police Chief James Fry reaches out to an old friend, Chief Gary Jenkins. He was the chief over at WSU at that time. It's a 10-minute drive from Moscow, she wrote. I didn't know it was that close. In the town of Pullman in Washington State. So Chief Gary had just been moved to the head of the university campus police. He wasn't even over Pullman police anymore at this point. By the time December rolled around, they're rolling in, they're about to, bust down the door of the Kohbergers, break it in and all that stuff. So now Chief Gary is now university campus police after he had been the chief in Pullman for 12 years. They've all worked together. He's worked with Fry and his team many, many times. So to me, it's like University of Idaho and all their police, Moscow police, Pullman PD, and WSU police should have all been working in concert. Like, to me, Moscow should have been sharing what they knew, with the head honchos. Vicky wrote, you'll learn in the book that the two college towns operate like siblings. Given they share an aquifer, I had to look that up. It's like a slab of land, only with water over it. They share that and an airport. When serious crimes occur in Moscow, the Pullman cops typically spring into action and vice versa, because the chances are anyone looking to make a getaway will drive through the other town on their way out of the area. So yeah, they're so close they should work together. But this is when they didn't. When the murders of the 4 University of Idaho students happened in Moscow in November 2022, the Pullman police were kept in the dark, much to their frustration, so even they were frustrated. Although Chief Gary Jenkins understood the imperative to keep the investigation under wraps. Okay, yeah, he's chief of police. He's police chief. He knows how important it is to keep your, biggest secrets secret. Of course, from the public. Sometimes you don't want to divulge the murder weapon. You don't say, hey, I was a K-bar knife and they left the sheath behind and guess what? We got his DNA. And, you don't necessarily want to blab all that in a press conference. I get it. But keeping it secret from the chief of police in your sister town, in your sister police station, that was a mistake. So Vicky wrote, even so, some sixth sense, I call it the Holy Spirit, told Chief Gary Jenkins to tell the guy in charge of camera security on Stadium Way in Pullman to retain video footage beyond the usual 60 days. Thank the Lord he did this. That would turn out to be critical because it showed Kohberger's car driving towards Moscow on the night of the murders. I wrote, hallelujah. Now imagine if Moscow PD had not caught Bryan until, let's say, January or February 2023. And imagine if Chief Gary had not taken that extra step, which he didn't have to do. Thank the Lord he got an unction to do this. He reached out to security and said on Stadium Way in Pullman to say, hey, can you just hold on to all video footage? Basically, don't let it get deleted. But what if they hadn't caught Bryan until the 61st day? Imagine that, the 61st day after Bryan made all these movements. And if Chief Gary had let the footage get replaced, I've seen it happen in different cases, just because Chief Gary was being kept in the dark about who they were honing in on. He gets a call like at the last minute. Also, I'll put Vicky's video at the end too, talking about the Gonzalez family, how they feel they've been kept in the dark too, just like the public, finding out certain things with the public. It's a video when Vicky's reacting, talking about the guilty plea last week and how she's going to say Kaylee's family, they had some kind of meeting the Friday before, but it was kind of just like, oh yeah, if a guilty plea, whatever, almost like it was mentioned as an aside. And they were still thinking, no, we don't want to go that route. So that's why they felt like they were just blindsided by this deal. Okay, go ahead, Bryan, you can plead guilty. You don't have to allocute. You don't have to tell anybody anything. You don't have to give them your motive. You don't have to give them an inkling about where you tossed the murder weapon. None of that. So now, on December 28th, 2022, Vicky writes, when most people, Chief Gary Jenkins included, were still ignorant of who had committed the Moscow murders, Chief James Fry phoned Chief Gary and he asked him, come over to MPD alone. Come on over by yourself to the police station. So this is December 28th. He gave him 2 days notice? And much to his surprise, Chief Gary Jenkins gets in that room. It's packed with Moscow cops, with Idaho State Police and FBI agents. I'm sure he didn't see that every day. Vicky wrote, Detective Brett Payne, who was leading the investigation. Now we can know that name because I remember from watching Molly, the DoorDash driver. Another thing, if we get more answers in this case, we will know for sure because some people are still arguing Molly was not the DoorDash driver. Brian Enton said it was confirmed she is the DoorDash driver. I'm trusting Brian Enton more than, randoms in these Facebook group chats or whatever, or in comments, because some people are just like, nope, she wasn't the DoorDash driver. And they don't offer any other information. Maybe they just don't like Molly because she said she saw Bryan there and parked right next to him. Maybe that's their deal. I don't know. But if this gag order wasn't in place still, answers like that could be so simple. It could be, here's our witness, Molly. Here's what she said she saw. Anyway, Detective Brett Payne, I remember seeing him in those body cam videos or hearing his name with Molly. I'm pretty sure. Maybe it was Ethan Chapin's body cam video. I'm getting them all confused. Anyway, Detective Brett Payne, who was leading the investigation, he told Chief Gary they finally had a suspect for the murders. Okay, so at least they roped him in now. But I still think they should have just been giving him tips and leads all the way since November 13th. That's my opinion. Detective Payne told Gary, look, the person who's the suspect is living in WSU housing. And so Payne said, look, Chief Gary, you need to be ready to get your team together to issue a warrant to search that house, that apartment at the right time. And then Detective Payne reveals the name of the suspect, Bryan Kohberger. Vicky wrote, Jenkins flinched. She does say it's an unusual name, but it is one that Chief Gary told the Detective Payne, I know that name. The room went completely silent. I bet it did. Chief Gary explained, okay, just months ago, when I was still with Pullman PD police chief, I interviewed Bryan on Zoom for an internship. And this is where I'm so grateful he followed his gut. Vicky wrote, something about Kohberger had made Gary think he wouldn't be able to earn the trust of colleagues, so he had given the position to somebody else. Wow. That's the best decision ever. That's how you really want to hear from God. And I have that email, so we see Gary Jenkins. It's Tuesday, April 12th, 2022. He's responding to Bryan. Bryan at 1:43 p.m., he wrote, Chief Jenkins, it was a great pleasure to meet with you today and share my thoughts and excitement regarding the research assistantship for public safety. I look forward to hearing from you. Best regards, Bryan. Gary wrote, Bryan, great to meet and talk with you as well. Gary. So he chose someone else and he made the right decision. I keep laughing because right now I'm envisioning that photo of, his intense stare. Can you imagine being on Zoom with somebody like Bryan? And, I believe it could have been Anjanette Levy who spoke about Bryan's intense look, how he doesn't blink often. She made a great video. I should link to it. I've listened to it over and over because she was literally in the courtroom. So people in the courtroom who were there for the plea hearing, they give us such great insight. But Gary's like, look, something about Bryan made him think colleagues won't trust him. So you don't have to have an intense stare, for someone to trust you. They can pick up on something. Chief Gary then drove back after this meeting to Pullman. He sat at his desk and went through his files. He sent them everything he had on Kohberger, the resume, the cover letter. He sent it to Detective Payne, and then his phone rang. So here's the snippet from the book.
Hey everyone, so little sneak preview of the Idaho 4, which comes out on Monday. There's a dramatic moment which involves Gary Jenkins, who's the chief of police on the Washington State University campus in Pullman, when he gets the call in late December 2022 to go over and visit Moscow, 10-minute drive away, the police station there. And he walks in and he finds a room packed with FBI agents, state police and Moscow police, and he's told that they're about to arrest somebody the other side of the country, but that person is a student on his watch at Washington State University. They tell him the name, Bryan Kohberger, and a light bulb goes off in Gary Jenkins' head. It's an unusual name, but he knows it because just a few months previously, when he was head of the Pullman Police Department, he interviewed Bryan Kohberger for an internship position. Unfortunately, he didn't give it to him.
Vicky wrote, Fry phones him to thank him. No problem, says Jenkins. Oh, and Gary, one more thing, says Fry, letting out a small chuckle. Aren't you glad you didn't accept his application? More than you know, replies Jenkins. So true. I couldn't help but immediately ask myself, was Bryan trying to emulate the Golden State Killer with this association with police? Did he want to be the undercover killer working for a police department? Oh, imagine the hell the police department would have caught. What if Bryan had gotten the internship? What if he had parlayed it into some full-time job in some capacity at the police department employee by day, killer by night? Was that what Bryan was going for? The Golden State Killer was Joseph James D'Angelo Jr. And it's wild, the same way that 72-year-old former police officer who became known as the Golden State Killer, the same way they caught him through that genealogical DNA type testing, it's, beyond. It's all that research. That woman, Cece, she does a great job with all that. That's the same way they tracked down Bryan Kohberger, by knowing eventually, okay, whoever is the son of this person, they got the DNA, they did the genealogy tracking, they got it down to Michael Kohberger, and they knew he's the father of whoever this killer is. But the Golden State Killer, Joseph D'Angelo, he was a police officer from 1973 to 1976. He was a police officer in Exeter, California. He used that to his advantage. People would trust him more. But on September 11th, 1975, D'Angelo, while he was a police officer, he shot and killed Professor Claude Snelling in front of his daughter at his California home. And he even kicked the daughter 3 times in the face and then fled. Kind of like Pullman is only 10 miles away from Moscow. Visalia, California, where that crime happened, is only 10 miles away from Exeter, where the Golden State Killer was a police officer. And then he went on to serve again as a police officer. From 1976 through 1979, D'Angelo was a police officer in Auburn, California. His true nature couldn't help but come out and get him fired. He got himself fired. He was fired for allegedly stealing some hammer and a can of dog repellent. I wonder if he used those in his crimes. So I'm wondering, okay, Bryan, would he have used his learning skills, his acumen, to try and be a better criminal, to try and really get away with murder? Bryan was 28 years old. He was the doctoral student at WSU when he was interviewed for that position, that online meeting. And they emailed back and forth. And just like the Golden State Killer, Bryan's home, living in Pullman, was only 10 miles away from Moscow. Now, I don't know if we've seen this essay yet, but, along with that interview, he wrote some kind of essay. Bryan wrote about his interest in assisting rural law enforcement agencies with how to better collect and analyze data. Can you imagine if Bryan just had all this data? If he was privy to all these addresses for women, and he already liked to monkey around with going into people's homes when they didn't expect him. Remember his friend Jeremy, his friend who died of an overdose back in Pennsylvania years ago, and Jeremy Saba, the stuff his mother said that Bryan did. He was sneaky. After Bryan's friend went to jail, Bryan was sneaking. He was sneaking in their house. He's lying to the mother, saying, oh yeah, I want to meet you there at the jail to visit him too. But instead, he didn't show up. He's sneaking in her house and stealing her iPad or something. Later, when Bryan was going through his 12 steps of recovery and he's showing up to apologize to her, he just appears in her kitchen. That's weird, sneaking around people's houses. So imagine if he had been privy to all this data in Pullman. Vulnerable people. I'm sure he would have used it to his sick advantage. So will we see that essay he wrote? I hope so. Another thing that can be released with the gag order, we hope. I don't know, universities are a little bit different. There's a new article out by the Daily Mail, too, which confused people. It talked about Bryan Kohberger's classmates and their thoughts on this 137-page manifesto. And the way it's written, you would initially think Bryan Kohberger wrote some kind of 137-page manifesto. But no, they were talking about Elliot Rodger. They were talking about his manifesto and the fact that Bryan did study Elliot, of course, and there were certain similarities there too. Bryan did all these studies inside the classroom at DeSales University before he even moved out west. And of course, he studied Elliot Rodger. It says in 2014, Rodger had killed 6 people and he wounded another 13 people in this violent rampage near the University of California in Santa Barbara before doing away with himself. So they talk with 2 of Bryan Kohberger's former classmates. It says they tell the Daily Mail they recall learning about Rodger in class, including his warped 137-page manifesto, laying out this motive of being an incel, involuntarily celibate, hating women, and all that. Even writing that he had a former friend, a girl named Maddie, so people are like, wait a minute, is this why Bryan may have targeted Maddie Mogan? Maybe. So this former friend that Elliot had named Maddie had, quote, eventually come to represent everything I hate and despise. So they're drawing the parallels between Bryan and Elliot. And they're talking about that Papa Rogers, oh my goodness, the Papa Rogers Facebook account. Some people are like, no, it couldn't have been Bryan because, after he was arrested, it was set back up, but it could have been someone else setting it up, a duplicate, a fake one. The Watts case studies, I believe I watched her video too. I'll try and look for that link and put it below. She goes over all the Papa Rogers Facebook posts. It's so much info. It had to be Bryan writing that, just teasing, the same way he asked the neighbor in the first few days, like, have you heard about the murders? For the same reason he drove back to Moscow, Idaho, just 9 a.m. after committing all these killings. He probably drove right in front of the house or behind it just to witness his handiwork. So he's trying to talk about it with his neighbor. Did you see that? The cops don't have anything. Ha ha ha. He was probably just feeling himself, feeling so smart. I believe he was Papa Rogers because I think he was all obsessed in the Facebook groups and, giving inklings of what he knew without getting caught. First of all, the profile photo to me looks very similar to him. It's like he made it just look like an older man in military gear. But one of Bryan's former classmates, Brittany Slavin, she told the Daily Mail, "I definitely think something inspired or sparked inside of him, and he was like, maybe I can get away with this. Maybe I want to know what it feels like." Just like Elliot Rodger, he stabbed to death his first 3 victims inside a home. And we know Bryan Kohberger fatally stabbed 4 people. We don't know how many people Bryan planned to stab. That's one thing that the prosecutor did say. When Bryan entered that house, do we even know if he knew Ethan was there? Did he just plan to kill 1, 2, 3 people? All possible. We won't really know until Bryan tells us, or we go to heaven and find out all the answers. But then Elliot, he went on to shoot 2 women dead outside the Alpha Phi. I think it's Alpha Phi. Sometimes I get these Greek names wrong. Alpha Phi house. Targeting the house because he said sorority sisters were the hottest in college. So they talk about how Bryan's victims were also sorority girls, a fraternity guy, obviously, beautiful, beautiful people. Is that why Bryan targeted them? Fun-loving, successful people. Elliot railed against this woman named Maddie in his manifesto. I don't think I read that whole thing. And now it's like, okay, is that why Bryan targeted Maddie? But it says, unlike Elliot, Bryan provided no manifesto. That's another thing technically we don't know. If there's a gag order, if Bryan had written anything, if they had found anything, I don't know, would they tell us? We know they found that book with the underlining on page 118. Would that kind of represent his manifesto? Did he underline like a whole paragraph, 1 or 2 words? Would that serve as, giving us a clue to his reasoning? We talked about that in the last video. But they're saying Bryan has offered no answers thus far as to why he did it, professed his innocence all these years, and then enters a guilty plea just to escape the death penalty. It talks about back in 2018 when Bryan was only 23. He was this recovering heroin addict. He started his degree majoring in psychology on the forensics track at DeSales University back in Pennsylvania. And he ended up graduating with that criminal justice degree 2022. He enrolled in WSU, the PhD program. Another guy was on the same track. His name was Josh Ferrero. He was back at DeSales with Bryan. He partnered with him in that biology project, and he says Bryan was a pleasure to work with. He was very diligent and very smart. He was proud to give the right answers. He knew stuff. He was happy to explain things and go into detail. Maybe sometimes too much. I guess too much detail. Bryan liked to run off at the mouth. But while Bryan was very engaged with the subject, Bryan still kept to himself, according to Josh. So, he was, I guess, kind with Josh. He partnered with him. I don't know if Josh had been a young lady. I don't know if it would have gone as smoothly. Josh said, if I tried to make small talk, he kind of shut it down pretty quickly. He was not really into talking about himself or what he does. He would shut it down. I never really got to know him on a personal level. And Josh did notice that Bryan especially avoided talking to other female students, other women. He didn't talk to a single one of them, he says. He was one of those kids who came to class, interacted with the professor, and left pretty much immediately. Never really hung around. Maybe Bryan knew he just didn't have a knack with women or something. And maybe that's why, Bryan had a good rapport with Dr. Catherine Ramsland. She called him pretty much polite too. But looking back, his fellow classmate, Brittany, said she never picked up on any red flags from Bryan. Maybe she didn't really talk with him, and so there was really no red flags to pick up. She remembers sitting near him in many of their forensic psychology classes. She worked on a couple of projects with him, so that's good. He came across as, quote, very educated, intelligent, and confident about the subject matter. But she also says socially he was shy and reserved. She said he was a little, I don't want to say weird, but quiet and shy. But when I look back, he didn't raise any red flags. She said, when I'm sitting here now, looking back, I can't be like, oh, he would definitely do something to someone. Like now thinking back, I try and pinpoint those things, but I can't. He was quiet. He was reserved. So it's kind of like the same thing. It's similar to Catherine Ramsland. He's polite and all that stuff. Now, Josh also took one of Catherine Ramsland's classes on psychological sleuthing, where students would be given real-life crime scenarios, and their job was to work out what happened. So they had to find out, was it a burglary? Was it a crime of passion? There's that term again. Was it an SA? Basically, the scenario would leave out certain aspects and we'd have to figure out why or who was there based off of whatever information we had. So that reminds me, maybe Bryan, if he really was Papa Rogers, it's like a game to him, like a real life game. Okay, I know everything. I know everything I did that night. I know the time I went in. I know everything that happened. These people don't. Let's see, how well they can sleuth. Like a real life sick game to him. So they delved into all these serial killers, mass murderers, BTK, Ted Bundy, Elliot. Elliot was only 22 in 2014 when he began that murder spree in Isla Vista. First stabbing his 2 roommates, then another man to death. Then he headed for that Alpha Phi house. They didn't answer the door, so he just opened fire on students that were coming back, killing 2 and wounding others. Then he's getting in his BMW. I mean, my goodness, you have a BMW. Just go off and be happy. He drove past a deli. He was just shooting at strangers, killing one of them. And then he just indiscriminately, Elliot shot at people before he crashed his car and ended his own life. When investigators studied Elliot, they found out, okay, he had been planning this for months. And what's so weird about Elliot, he had a life of privilege. It's just weird. He was the British-born son of a prominent Hollywood movie exec, but he just hated women. He blamed women for everything, for, never engaging in lovemaking, for, being an incel. He railed against all these women he could never have. So I wonder if he, just got shot down over and over. Did he set his sights too high? I don't know about Elliot. I'd have to read his manifesto. It's just weird when anyone blames an entire group of people for their problems. That's what he called his day of retribution. He had emailed this manifesto titled My Twisted World to several people, including his therapist and his dad, and he had uploaded some disturbing video to YouTube named Retribution. I don't think I ever watched that. Maybe I did. So he became this twisted hero to incels. Instead of everyone being disgusted by what Elliot did, some people, I guess, called him a hero. Like, yeah, that's the way you get back at those, selfish women who wouldn't give you a date. So Josh remembers Dr. Kathleen Ramsland showed Elliot's manifesto to their class, and Josh was horrified by it. He says, I remember thinking it was the craziest thing I'd ever seen because I can't believe people talk like this. He's jaded, he's angry with the world, and thinks society owes him these favors and sexual favors, and he's never been with a woman, so he hates women and wants to kill them all. So they look back, and Josh and Brittany is like, well, we didn't really notice Bryan showing any particular interest in Elliot, nor any of the other killers they studied. But of course, they didn't go home with Bryan. They don't know what was on his brain. But Brittany now believes Bryan may have taken inspiration from Elliot and possibly Bundy. That's what people are finding out, to commit his own crime. Brittany said, I think he could have been inspired by them. And she added, they learned a lot about how certain killers thought or how they killed. From what we learned, Brittany said, I could definitely see where it maybe intrigued him because we learned a lot of gruesome things and a lot of cases where there was a lot to take in. So I definitely think it intrigued him and made him think, what if I did this or something of a bad nature? So it's true. They're talking about, according to Dateline, before the murders, Bryan made several online searches for Ted Bundy, and we went over all his horrific stuff. Well, not all of it, but we went over his horrific sorority murders at the, I think I'm supposed to say Chi Omega. Nope, it's Chi Omega. And then how he searched for Bundy before the murders, and then after the murders, he watched shows about the serial killer, one YouTube show named Ted Bundy, Essence of a Psychopath. And then Bryan dressed up to look like Bundy. Not only does that fuel the comparisons, of course, to serial killers, but also this Papa Rogers character. It's kind of fueling the potential links to Elliot Rodgers Bryan may have had. They're talking about the University of Idaho murders, this huge case discussion group. I don't know how long I've been in there, but yeah, it has nearly 250,000 members, if not more. But it was Papa Rogers in that group. His comments, there was stuff people didn't really realize. Okay, this was November 30th, 2022. This post from Papa Rogers said, of the evidence released, the murder weapon has been consistent as a large fixed blade knife. This leads me to believe they found the sheath. Nobody knew that. The cops hadn't told us that yet. And then only later, January 2023, when we got the affidavit after he was arrested, then we knew the knife sheath had been found and his DNA found on it. But would we have known that November 30th? And there's others. If you look at Watt's Case Studies YouTube channel, she goes over so many of them. Like, I remember reading them real time too. I was like, whoa. Papa Rogers had posted this photo of the cops, behind the house. And he's like, oh, Papa Rogers, like, they're on the high side of the house. This leads me to believe they found some evidence back there, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh my goodness. And now it turns out all these months later, years later, we find out Bryan did park behind the house. And that's what the prosecutor said. So we finally get that confirmed. And I even read this other interview. I wish I could remember who it was. A woman, I think she lived nearby. I don't know if it's in Vicky Ward's book. We'll see coming up. But she took, I believe it was Vicky Ward, behind the house. They were staring. This is when the house was still there. And how easily you could identify Maddie's bedroom, with a lot of times maybe the curtains, shades open, with Maddie's pink boots in the windows. I think she had an M. This girl told some writer, it could have been Vicky. This girl was like, yeah, sometimes I'd drive back here. She must live nearby. She would park back there. She'd get out of her car. She could see Maddie right there in the mirror doing her makeup and all that stuff. How many times do you think Bryan did that? Pulled behind there, some lonely evening. He's gone on hikes by himself, talking to no one, having a friendship with the one woman, Ne Young Ko, and that went south. But even before that, how many times did he likely drive back there and just stare at Maddie? Unbeknownst to her. It's so scary. But they also talk about Bryan Kohberger posting that questionnaire when he was still at DeSales, posting it on Reddit asking people, how did you prepare for your crime before you left the home? How did you travel to and enter the location that the crime occurred? Why did you choose that victim or target over others? That's just so scary. You know how some people, like, for the first time I ever went on a cruise, like my sister took me on a cruise recently. So I'm watching all these cruise videos, like, what do you do? I don't know. But imagine Bryan, he's researching for a much more nefarious activity. Let me be the best killer I can. And I'm sure he did this. Let me take the best of the criminals. Choose a sorority type of house, choose a K-bar knife for some reason, make it, something in this town where they're not used to crime, where it'll create a big splash. Because he must have decided, I'm just going to be infamous. I don't know when he made that decision. But Papa Rogers on Facebook, he creeped people out by the stuff he knew. The Facebook administrator said things reached a head. Papa Rodger got very nasty online. Things reached a head the night before Bryan got arrested. So this is weird. They were closing in on him. Imagine the 28th, there was that meeting. Chief Gary finds out who their main suspect is, Papa Rogers. And now, December 29th, things get very nasty online with Papa Rogers. That's what the Facebook administrator says. One of the mods removed Papa Rogers from the group. He was creeping people out. And then that same account created its own group filled with photos of Maddie. That's so weird. I wonder if I was in that group. It says, following Bryan's arrest, the Papa Rodger account never posted again, and all Papa Rogers posts mysteriously disappeared from the Facebook group. But authorities have not confirmed or denied yet whether that was really Bryan, but the Facebook administrator believes it was. The admin, Christine Cameron, said, looking back at the things that he said, how he interacted with members, how he interacted with admin. Hindsight is 2020. When you're going through it, you just think, this guy is creepy. He says things that make your skin crawl, but you just think he's another guy behind a screen saying crazy things. But for me, after it all comes out and I'm looking at Elliot Rodger, I think the parallels are just too much. And I really think he chose the name Papa Rodger, I'm just getting that, for a specific reason. I think that he wanted to be perceived and seen as the father of Elliot Rodger. Wow. Elliot Rodger, you're my son. I can do much worse than you. Oh my goodness, I'm going to school you, son. Anyway, Christine said, I think he wanted to do it better than Elliot Rodger did. Wow. Josh says, based on what they learned in classes together, it could be possible Bryan was Papa Rodger. Josh said, you learn in these courses that after someone commits the crime, they often go back to the scene. And in the digital age, a way to go back to that scene is to go incognito with an alias or a pseudonym online and get into these groups and talk about it. It's a way of reliving the fantasy and reliving the hype. Josh said, we went over that in detail in class, and to him, Bryan fits the bill for an incel. He called them, they're jaded, they're frustrated, and then it turns over into boiling anger. It's like a pedo who views, CSAM to kind of scratch the itch. You can only be in the community for so long without being truly on the inside and committing those acts of hate, without saying, I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to go and commit that crime. They think at some point, with Bryan studying all this criminology, maybe starting to have more and more problems in real life, of course, we've seen bumping heads with different people, not treating people kindly, so much so that he loses that teaching assistant job. Again, I ask, is that what sent him over the edge? He would have to go back to Pennsylvania, basically a failure, not completing his doctorate if he couldn't have completed it without all the benefits of the TA job. Did he decide to have his day of retribution then? So instead of just continually learning about crime, did Bryan choose to be the next case that people say we're going to study him for years and years? Again, of course, we still talk about Charles Manson more than 50 years later. Brittany hopes that Bryan didn't intentionally pursue education about the criminal mind for the purpose of plotting his own murders. Again, that would have been a long plot. She said, I hope that was not his intention, but he definitely took some of the info we learned and ran with it. I don't want to say that was his intention to go into these classes and learn how to harm someone or people like he did, but he definitely came into the field with some type of interest, and he just took it completely the wrong way and twisted it, indeed. Let's read 2 Samuel 5:24. As soon as you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the poplar trees, move quickly, because that will mean the Lord has gone out in front of you to strike the Philistine army. So David did as the Lord commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines all the way from Gibeon to Gezer. Those verses were intriguing me because I was like, wait a minute. David would always inquire of the Lord, should I do this? Should I do that? When the Lord answered, as soon as you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the poplar trees, that was wild. He was advising David to go attack this army that was coming after him, go around and surprise them. But if you listen and you'll hear almost like the sound of marching, like angels perhaps marching to help David in the tops of the poplar trees. That fascinated me. The part that fascinated me is David listened to the Lord. He listened to these tips on how to succeed against this army coming against him. I think of that the same way with Chief Gary, even though he was kept in the dark, perhaps a little longer than he should have been, but they didn't track down Bryan until the end of December. So, they couldn't have given him Bryan's name much earlier. But even though he was kept in the dark, he still, in his gut, months prior, did not select Bryan. And that just reminds me, even if you just don't even know why you don't like a person, even if you don't know why they're giving you the ick, the Holy Spirit gives us that unction, that direction on who to stay away from. I remember driving in California once, and I'm in the left lane just driving along, and I really felt like that internal voice of truth. Not always audible like a person speaking, but I felt that voice telling me, get in the next lane. And I didn't. I ignored it, and I just stayed. And then all of a sudden I get hit in the back. Thankfully, it wasn't that much. It was just a tap, but I was like, oh, now I see. I should have gotten over there. Now I try and listen more, to heaven. I feel like Chief Gary, he was listening to heaven. Don't hire that guy. You'll regret it. You might not know why. Make sure that video footage is not deleted. And who knows how many instances we'll see when we get all this info. Really praying Jesus, the media lawyer, is successful in finally dropping this gag order so we can learn truly more facts. We can learn, okay, was Bryan Papa Rogers? Will we finally know that? What will we get of his writings? Will we see any of his essays? Will we learn more? If anything, I think the families of the loved ones, they're the ones who deserve to know more. Of course, it will be cold comfort if we learn, Bryan really was targeting Maddie. And because of these reasons, he wanted to emulate these serial killers and leave little clues, little breadcrumbs. And what will that do? Of course, it won't bring Maddie back. And I understand why some parents were okay with the plea and some weren't. So listen to Vicky Ward talk about that part. the reaction to the plea, who she spoke with, and many more details. So thank you so much for watching all this. Again, hopefully if I can get the time, there's so many different cases going on, so much going on with this case. I do still want to take a deep dive look at the Peacock documentary about the Idaho murders, because certain people speak out we haven't heard from before. It was really good. Before Friday rolls around in a couple of days, where we will start watching on July 11th that Amazon Prime series. I don't even know how many episodes. I should check that too. Of course, we can't watch it together, but we can discuss it. So thank you so much for watching all of this. Let me know what you think about, wow, Bryan not being able to work at Pullman Police Department and all the other topics we discussed today. Take care.
Took a photo, got my passport, and now I'm sitting down here with Vicky Ward to discuss sort of the stunning news yesterday. I think we're all in shock. And I haven't even had time to read up and understand how and why this happened. So I am so glad you're going to sit down with us and sort of walk through a plea deal.
Right. Well, the answer, Jess, is that, in the last 24 hours, I've spoken obviously to Steve Gonsalves and to Olivia Gonsalves, who right now is on her way from California to Boise for the hearing tomorrow. I spoke to James Fry, who was the Moscow police chief running the investigation. I've spoken to 3 of the kids who were going to testify in the first week of the trial. I've spoken to the local reporter, who you'll see in the book is a big character who's very tight with Bill Thompson. This came as a complete shock. And I mean, a complete shock. And the reason the Gonsalves family is so upset about it is not the actual fact of it, but it's the fact that they feel they've had no time to process it, that this has been an agonizing wait of nearly 3 years, during which time they feel they've been very much kept in the dark, not given the support that they feel they needed. Olivia once said to me, there is no handbook for what you're supposed to do when something this horrific happens to a young adult in your family. And the way the Gonsalves told it to me, there was a call on Friday in which there was a mention of a plea deal. It was all the families with the prosecutors, but very...
So this was like a group call?
Yeah, very sort of theoretical. Nothing, and I think Olivia was like, well, we're not, they were proceeding as if a trial was going to happen. Sunday afternoon, they literally at 4 p.m. Sunday, the phone goes and it is the prosecutor saying, it's, we've taken a deal. It's too fragile not to take. This is, incredibly delicate situation, and it's done. And I think that what the families felt, they had no opportunity to say, well, hang on a minute. If he's going to plea, then could he at least agree to a full confession so we can understand why he targeted the King Road house and what happened that night. And Steve said to me, there was no negotiation. We had no voice in this. And sort of what the prosecutors are saying now, or, we reached out to the family. It is true. I understand. I haven't spoken to Stacey Chapin, who I'm very close with, but it is my understanding from the Gonsalves family, and it's my bet from everything I know about her, and I know her very well by now, that she will be glad that this has ended this way. She never really wanted to think too much about Bryan Kohberger. She only reluctantly was going to show up to the trial. Her view was that nothing was bringing Ethan back. He has 2 remaining triplets, Maisie and Hunter, left. And I think her view was, we need to focus on the living
and why waste brain cells on Bryan Kohberger? Easier said, obviously, than done. My understanding, again, from Steve Gonsalves and actually from Olivia, is that the Laramies that's Maddie's mum and stepfather, are also, they're okay with it. The Kernodals are not. So
it is very divided among the family.
It's very, very, I mean, and one of the themes that I get into in the book is actually the divisions between the families, because the book it's also the story of a town. It's the story of two towns, actually, Moscow and Pullman. And it's a really interesting part of the world, really interesting society. You've written about this. That town is very divided between this conservative church and, it's a very liberal college town. And in a way, the families and the divisions between them reflect that sort of world. So I think it's very interesting. The Chapins from the get-go just trusted the police chief, James Fry, who, by the way, became a great friend of mine. He's a terrific guy. And I think he regretted the communications aspect of the investigation. He never for a second thought that there was bad police work. He thought everyone worked together fantastically. But I think he thought what he didn't have experience in was how to handle the media on a scale like they descended on Moscow. And he realized in hindsight, he made a terrible mistake, staying quiet the first couple of days. And that's, they're trained to stay quiet to protect the investigation. And for the same reason, that's why they don't tell the families the details that you would expect they would know. And instead, the families are really, really kept in the dark. I was really quite surprised. And in the world we live in, with cell phones and social media, that becomes a real problem. So, for example, on the day that the murders happened, Kaylee's, the Gonsalves sisters could see from their friends showing them videos that police tape was going up around the King Road house. And they're all sitting there gathered to watch Sunday football. And they wait for hours before eventually, around 4 or 5 p.m., there's a knock on their door. And it's not at the Moscow police, because they live up near Kerdelen. It's and they come in and they say, your daughter is dead, and so is Maddie. But that is about it. And you'll read in the book how Olivia, the eldest, who's pregnant at the time with child number 3, lives in California. She and Robbie, her husband, drive through the night. Robbie drives, the 2 kids are in the back seat. And Olivia is just working the phones to get answers from anyone who could have talked to Kaylee or Maddie before the murders. And that, that's when Olivia sort of goes into full detective mode, and she finds the Grubhub video